So this presentation was originally an introduction to information architecture, but because I gave a similar talk a year ago for Opsgility, I thought I'd update the title simply to talk about current concepts in SharePoint information architecture, simply because times are a-changin'. There's some new concepts out there, and I'm going to be covering these in depth in our presentation today. Thank you all for joining me, and it's great to be here. A little bit about myself. My name is Becky Bertram, and I'm the owner of Savvy Technical Solutions, which is a consulting company based in the greater St. Louis area. I pretty much do all SharePoint all the time, but now it's more like Office 365 as well in Azure, insofar as they interact all together as a single stack of products. You can see this picture at the right here was me last week at Ignite in Orlando, and so a lot of what I'm going to be covering today, or a couple of the concepts I should say, are based on feedback or information that was revealed last week. So this is some brand new stuff I'm going to be talking about, and some stuff isn't really even in production yet, but I want to give you a heads up of what's coming down the road and how this is going to affect how you decide to organize the information in your sites. I've been a SharePoint Server MVP, which I think now is called Office and Office Servers, but since 2007, I helped author a book on SharePoint development, published by Rox, and of course I've done 2 Opsgility on-demand training courses as well. I'm the president of the local St. Louis SharePoint user group, and I also have helped put on a number of SharePoint Saturdays in our town. We're going to be having another one coming up in January, so if you want to take part, please go to spsevents.org and sign up, either as a speaker or as an attendee. So today in this session, I'm going to give a quick overview of these SharePoint concepts. I'm glad we did the poll at the beginning to figure out who's familiar with concepts like lists, libraries, content types, and whatnot, because I noticed there's maybe about a quarter of you aren't really familiar with those concepts, but maybe 3/4 of you are. So that being said, I'm going to sort of fly through the concepts so that if you have not heard of these things before, you get a general overview of what we're talking about. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to move on to sort of some overall concepts that we'll be discussing in terms of general information architecture. And we're going to talk about it in the context of Office 365 groups and teams and site collections, and even getting into things like communication sites and the newly announced hub sites. So we'll be talking about this at the end. So first, let's talk about some basic SharePoint concepts. Site collections and sites, lists and libraries, and content types. Oh, you know what? I was going to show my webcam. I don't know if you guys, there we go. I had it on and then I turned it off, but there you go. I thought I want to wave and say hi to everybody. So if you want, you can see me. This is me here in my home office giving the presentation. I find it's always nicer to know that there's a real person that's presenting to me and it's not some recording somewhere, but I am a real person with flesh and blood here in O'Fallon, Illinois. All right, we'll move on now. Okay, so let's talk about the concept of a site. This is a difficult thing because SharePoint is, by its very nature, a web-based application. So SharePoint is a site. In fact, is all of Office 365. It is a web-based platform. There are, of course, the Office desktop tools, but Office 365 user interface primarily is web-based. So it begs the question, what is a site? Well, when we talk about SharePoint in particular, the word site has a very specific meaning. A site has a unique URL in SharePoint. And really, the site is like a container or a bucket that contains other things such as lists and libraries, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you think about how you organize your desktop files, you've got a folder, and you might have a big folder called My Documents. That's sort of a generic container, right? You can have lots of specific folders inside the My Documents folder. In the same way, the concept of a site is sort of an overarching concept, which you can have lots of information stored inside of it. A site also has security settings that are attached to it, and it could have themes attached to it. There are a number of configuration settings that when applied to a site will apply to everything inside that site. On top of that, a site could have a subsites or child sites inside of it. So in other words, if I have my top level site, or the root site would be if I go to my tenantname.sharepoint.com. That's going to be the root site. Inside of that, I may have a site for departments, and inside of that, my department site has a subsite for accounting, and then my accounting site might have a subsite for restricted access. So the idea is that a lot of times if you apply settings to a site, it might trickle down to those child sites or subsites. So let's take a look at it. If I have a site called HR, it might have a unique URL of /HR that would be inside its parent top level site. And inside there, I've got a number of libraries. If I have a library called Site Pages, there would be a file in there called Home, and that URL is home.aspx. Keep in mind that in SharePoint, web pages are considered files inside of a library, just the way a Word document would be inside a document library. It's just the fact that the kind of file that it is happens to be a web page that's rendered in the page on the screen. But that being said, a file, a web page, is a file inside a library called Site Pages. So you can see how in HR, I might have my Site Pages library to contain my web page content. The Site Assets library is where things like images or documents that I upload directly to that web page are stored. But then I might have several document libraries, and they don't have to be the same name. One could be called Employee Documents, another one could be called Training Manuals, and that's because the kind of document libraries stored inside the HR site are going to be unique to that site. Additionally, I might have a list called a calendar type list, which is called HR Training Events. If I look to my right here and I see my IT site, you can see that I might have a similar structure, but it's got its own unique URL, and in this site, I've got a different set of lists and libraries within that site. Even though it has a calendar as well, it's a different calendar with different information on it. So really a site is just a way of containing information, lists and libraries, and having configuration settings. And again, a site can have subsites inside of it. So when we talk about site hierarchy, for example, again, the home URL for SharePoint sites are always going to be tenant.sharepoint.com. So that top level site would typically just be, if we wanted to represent it simply as that trailing slash at the end, that it would be the top level site. And this is typically where intranets are created in Office 365, simply because that is the most basic root URL that you can navigate to, and that's set up with your tenant out of the box when you sign up for Office 365. So in this example, perhaps I've got in my top level site, I have a subsite called Departments. You can see underneath the name of it, it's got a URL of, it would be tenant.sharepoint.com/departments. I've got another subsite called Employee Corner, and another one that's my search center where I've configured search. In this approach, each of these sites are considered siblings to one another, and they are all children to that top level intranet home site. If we break this out a little more, we could say that inside that department subsite, I now have a different subsite for each department. So you can see here we're starting to build quite the tree, and you can see in here how each of these subsites builds on the URL of its parent site. So accounting has /department/accounting, marketing /department/marketing, etc. And finally, if we move down the tree here, we can see that we can even go deeper. So if I had, because the security settings are inherited, say everybody has read permission to everything at the intranet home site, so the departments is going to pick up that permission that everybody can read it. The HR subsite is going to pick up the same permissions that everybody can read it, but perhaps when we get to the HR restricted site, we decide to break inheritance so the security settings do not inherit from its parent site, but instead we say that only people inside that HR department can read that information. So this is a very typical kind of configuration for a lot of intranet type sites, where we've got information that's sort of this hierarchical format that's going from lowest level of granularity to the highest level of granularity. A site collection itself is that hierarchy of sites. A site collection is self-contained, which means that you can have multiple site collections and they are not going to share navigation, they're not going to share security, they're not going to share configuration, content types, list libraries, anything else. They really are their own unit and they are self-contained. Each site collection has a special kind of administrator called a site collection administrator. And these are the people that are allowed to turn on and off certain settings within that entire tree of sites, that entire hierarchy of sites. They can turn on and off functionality, and they can assign user permissions to others. So there is a role called a site owner, but that site owner role is typically for just one particular site within the site collection. But the site collection itself is managed by a site collection administrator. Site collection configuration oftentimes applies to the whole hierarchy of sites. So there are some settings which are going to be set basically at the top level site, and that's going to apply to everything within the site collection. It's also the top level of security. As I mentioned before, because we have this inheritance model, any sites created inside of that top level site are going to inherit the same level of security, unless you decide to break that inheritance model of security. So if we look at the diagram we had before, basically everything inside this is considered a site collection. So your entire intranet site is one site collection. This is going to be an important concept as we talk later on about how groups work. As you can see here, my nice little animation, that entire thing is one site collection. So let's move on and talk about lists and libraries. A SharePoint list or library is fundamentally an entity with rows and columns. And I only made this nice little diagram just to point out the fact that you're probably already familiar with this basic concept. If you've worked with an Excel workbook or an Access table or even SQL Server or any kind of database, you understand that there's really a basic concept of having rows and columns. And the columns have titles, and rows are discrete pieces of information within that column. In that sense, a SharePoint list or library is no different. So what makes a list a list? Well, in a list, each column of data describes the overall item. For instance, if I'm creating an event, the event has a title. If you can see in the screenshot, we're going on a company picnic. It's going to be in a shady park, and it has a start and an end time. In this example, really no one piece of information is more important than the other. It's not like the location is more important than the title or the start time is more important than the location. Really, combined as a total, all the information that's been collected describe the overall thing in the list. It is possible to have attachments. If you can see in the screenshot, the little paperclip icon on the left indicates that you can actually upload one or more files associated with the list item. But in this case, the files are supporting information. So perhaps in this company picnic event, I may have uploaded a screenshot of where the park is located from some satellite image or a map, or maybe it's a flyer talking about what the activities are, who to bring. But again, any files really would be supporting the overall information within the list. A library is really no different, the construct is no different, except for the fact that there always has to be a file associated with every list item in that library. So really a document is a list item that just happens to have a file associated with it. And in this case, generally the information you're collecting within those columns describe the document. So for example, if I have a document that's related to a project, I might upload information that's the project manager associated with that project. So if I upload a document called project scope document, and then I say that Becky Bertram is the project manager, well really the fact that Becky Bertram is a project manager is in some way pertinent to the file itself. So generally, the column data describes the document. It gives you helpful information about the context of the document, that would be pertinent to the document itself, unlike a list item where all of the columns come together to really describe the information. Libraries do allow for check-in, check-out behavior, unlike a list item. Libraries can also have minor as well as major versions. List items can't, they can only have major versions. And that's because in a library we have this concept of you're able to create, if you want, a draft version, which means that I can be actively working on a document and saving it while everybody else is looking at the previously published version. Published versions would have a whole number associated with them, whereas the draft versions would have an incremental number. Office does allow for co-authoring, which is also another nice feature when you're working with documents in a library, which is different than working with list items. So next, let's talk a little bit about content types. Much like site columns, content types are also defined in a site. Site columns really are a way of defining a piece of information that's going to be collected in a list. So a site column may say birthday or employee ID, and you can define a site column as a type of information. It's going to have a name and a type of information. And if you're formatting it as currency, you can specify how to display decimals and things like that. But the idea is you take these site columns and you can bring them together to form a particular kind of content. And this is important because it's usually reusable. So let's think of it this way. If I have a document library called expense reports, but I want to be able to have each different department, which has its own site, be able to collect its own expense reports, I want to make sure that they all are collecting the same pieces of information, are using the same template, are using the same workflow. There may be a number of things that I really want to be consistent across all the sites where this information is being collected. So if that's the case, I create a content type. So really the name of the content type helps describe it. If my content type is called expense report, I'm probably not collecting project information, right? So the name is the most obvious identifier, but additionally you've got things like the site columns again that are define it. So if I have a project document, I might have a project ID, a project manager, maybe the name of the project. I may have different pieces of information that are being collected so that anytime a document is uploaded to my project documents library, regardless of the site it's in, it's always going to be collecting the same kinds of information. A content type, it's possible to associate a document template with that. So for example, for my company, Savvy Technical Solutions, when I go and drive to a client, I have an expense report that I've created, which is an Excel spreadsheet. So I create a new expense report for every week, which means that each expense report, I have 7 days that are planned out, and I can specify if it was driving or travel or internet or phone or whatever that I'm getting reimbursed for. So each time I have a new expense report, I go to my expense reports library and I say, I want to create a new expense report. It's using that expense report content type, and it's using my template that I've uploaded. So necessarily it's going to open up my Excel spreadsheet that has all the formulas and everything in there. This is a really handy way of making sure that people are always using the same template. And additionally, a problem that often happens is if you have a template that's just a Word document or Excel spreadsheet that you've uploaded to some library, because everybody can edit that, and the way Office is set up now, if you click, if you open up the template, start filling it out and click Save, what's happened? You have now updated your template with filled in information. That's really annoying, or has security implications if the next person coming along doesn't have a blank template anymore, but now has a filled in file. That is a very typical way things are done on a shared drive or on a file system, but in SharePoint that becomes really problematic because the template can be so easily just opened up within the Office application. So that being said, if you go with this document template model, it means that if a content type is created and a template is associated with it, when someone creates that new file, they will be prompted to save it back to that library with a unique name, but there's no danger of overwriting the original template. It's also possible to apply information management policies, specifically retention policies, to a content type. This is also helpful because you may have a company-wide retention policy that says every time someone creates an expense report, we only want to keep them for 5 years. After that, they're going to go to their recycle bin. This is a way of having documents be purged on a regular basis without interference of having or someone having to come along and take time out of their day to plow through a bunch of different libraries, which, let's be honest, never happens. But that way you can set the retention not on everything within a library, but maybe only on certain files. So if I do have a library for project documents, I could say that the weekly status reports can get deleted after 1 year, but I could say that the contracts need to stay for 7. So you can have different content types within a single library or list and different retention policies set up on those different content types. It's also possible to create reusable workflows that can be applied to content types. This is sort of more of a passé kind of thing. It was a thing we did in SharePoint 2010. It's not really done so much anymore, but it is possible. And the last thing to specify is that a content type does have a parent content type. So you can't say that I want to have a document content type that inherits from a list item content type. Really, content types can inherit from one another. But what that means is when a content type inherits from its parent, it's going to pick up all those site columns that were defined in the parent content type. So for instance, say I create a parent content type called a project document, and so each I specify that there's a project ID and a project manager specified with that. Well, I could now have a content type called project scope document that inherits from my project document. So my project scope document might have a unique template associated with it, but it's going to pick up those columns from its parent content type. That way you can create sort of one content type to define things like site columns, and then create child content types that maybe have unique templates, unique retention policies, etc. So it's possible to create rather exotic inheritance models surrounding content types. There are a lot of organizations that put a really great amount of effort into categorizing information this way. Furthermore, we have things like the content search web part, which in publishing sites in particular, or even in search results, which heavily rely on these content types to create tailored results. For example, if I want to return to all my most recent project documents, because I now know that I'm using a content type and every project document is required to have a project ID and project manager, now I can create a view where I say, show me all the most recent project documents, and I can actually render to the web page the project ID and the project manager. And I can do that because I know that those columns of information are being collected with each document that's being uploaded. I can't do that if it's just a normal document and there's no site columns associated with it. So why use content types? It's a way to reuse a definition of content across a site or across a site collection. When you specify a content type, it's basically copied down to that local list or library. And as I mentioned, lists and libraries can contain more than one content type. All right, that being said, are there any questions? That's sort of a brief overview of site collections, lists, libraries, and content types. Are there any questions about that? Nope. Okay. All right, well, if you want more information on this, I go into great detail on this in the introduction to SharePoint Online course from Opsgility. And what you've seen is just a brief introduction, but we have a lot of exercises and labs that you can walk through in your own environment if you want to experiment with creating the kind of content types that I've mentioned and get a hands-on feel of how these are used. All right, now that we've talked about that, I'm going to move on and talk about the concept of governance. And governance is going to guide the rest of our conversation here. So what is governance? Well, governance is really a fancy way for saying managing change. So back in the olden days of software, when it took developers that had to collect requirements, go away, spend a couple weeks, build something, and come back, Basically what happened is it cost a lot of time, it cost a lot of money, and so the idea is that a lot of work went into deciding what change was going to be made in the software. This typically is called a governance committee, and these were the people that were stakeholders that were heavily invested in what change needed to take place in the software. However, because SharePoint is a web-based tool, it means that change is very easily enacted on a SharePoint site. So it means that I no longer have to call up a web developer and say, can you please create a new site for me? Now, if you have the right permissions, you just go right into SharePoint and say, create site, and there you go. What this means is in the early days of SharePoint, because it was so easy for anybody to enact change within their SharePoint implementation, that there was a lot of out of control growth, which meant it was a lot of heavy adoption, which was great, but it became very, very difficult to maintain this, to upgrade this, to migrate this to new platforms. When there's on-premise environments, we had to upgrade to new versions of SharePoint, etc. And so it became important to be able to balance out heavy adoption and a lot of flexibility with being able to manage the growth and the adoption of SharePoint sites. So specifically what I want to talk about now is the concept of greater control versus greater flexibility. So if we look at the governance spectrum, we can see that on one end of the spectrum we have more control, on the other end we have less control. If we think about SharePoint, kinds of SharePoint sites, or the way SharePoint sites are used, on the very left-hand side, we've got this concept of a public site. SharePoint was used with, there used to be a product called Content Management Server that was a company called Encompass that Microsoft bought in 2001, and then they called the product Content Management Server, and that product was decommissioned when it was rolled into SharePoint 2007. The purpose of this kind of product was to be able to create public-facing sites typically. A lot of them were very web and text-heavy, catalog-type sites to be able to create a lot of public content. But when we think about our public site, we think about the fact that this is a site where this is the greatest amount of control you want, because this is the public perception, the image of what people have of your company or your organization. So clearly you want to have a great amount of control because you want to be very specific and very controlled about the message that's being communicated to people outside of your company or outside of your organization. You need to have a lot of levels of approval, checks and balances to make sure that something inappropriate or damaging is not released on your website. In my past life, I have worked with utilities, a number of utilities, and a lot of telecom companies, and where there's fierce competition. And in fact, I worked at one company where its competitor hired people full-time to just scour their competitors' websites and, in fact, report them to the governing agencies if they saw anything amiss on the public website so that they could be fined or sued. So in some cases, this can have greater ramifications than others, but there can be sort of branding issues or even legal ramifications if the content is not completely perfect. So slightly less strategic than that, but still kind of important, is this concept of your intranet homepage. So if we think about the kind of content that's being published on the intranet homepage, you probably want to have things such as press releases that were talked about your company. Maybe you want to be able to surface things about from HR about benefits or training, but you probably, depending on your internet site, you may not want to have things about the chili cook-off in the cafeteria of the 3rd level being on the intranet homepage. Typically, the intranet homepage is something that is really, again, pretty strategic, depending on the size of your company, for the information that's being communicated to a lot of people. So you still want to have a great degree of control. Beyond that, we have the department site, which is basically, again, if I work within HR or IT or finance or marketing or whatever, I've got a site. This is information typically generated by the department or the area, but being published out to others, which means that I'm not in the IT department, but I'm looking for information from IT. So you still want to have a certain degree of control insofar as this is information that people outside of your department are coming to your department for. They want to know who the contacts are within your department. They want to know the official guidelines, the official forms, the official policies that they're trying to get to. As we move down the spectrum now, we're starting to get into a little bit less control. When you get into department collaboration sites, these typically are sites that are set up for people within a department to be able to do things more like document management with one another. So if I'm in the finance department and I'm generating lots of reports, I may want libraries where I can store my weekly reports in, or my annual reports. This is stuff that's not so important for people outside of the department to get to, but people within the department want to work on together. As you move down the level of control, you get to things such as application-specific or cross-departmental collaboration. Application-specific would be such as I'm in, excuse me, I am in the HR department and there's a specific procedure. So we are actually researching a new benefits provider. So we may have a subsite in there that's specifically about benefits. So that's not just everybody in the HR department collaborating in general. This is really a specific set of functionality, and it may require a whole site because maybe there's only 3 people in the HR department that are tasked with that, and maybe there's 7 different document libraries required. There are times where this may be considered, again, a very specific but ongoing task that's happening. You also may have cross-departmental collaboration. This may be something such as if we're working on compliance, this may be something where we need people from the QA team and the legal department and engineering to all work on together. It may not fall neatly underneath the hierarchy just of our basic site hierarchy with departments and collaboration inside that department. When we get down the spectrum, we start looking at things like projects. Project sites, again, may or may not be cross-departmental in nature. It's probably going to be limited just a very specific set of people that are working on it, and oftentimes things like projects are time constrained. In my mind, having a project that's time constrained is very critical to understanding the amount of flexibility that's allowed. For instance, when we look in the left side of the spectrum, we want to be able to have high control in how we organize or manage that site because we want to make sure that people, the information that's being communicated is optimal. But if people are working on a project, it's really only limited the visibility to a certain amount of people. We want them to have maximum flexibility to create whatever kind of documents they need, and it's really no skin off our back insofar as if we have policies in place, we can end up sort of deleting those sites or site collections after a period of time, so that we don't. So if somebody creates a bunch of really huge documents, it doesn't matter quite as much if we know that those documents aren't going to stick around for eternity, but we know that they're only going to be needed for like a year. So again, there's less risk as our security is lessened, as the time frame in which that site is lessened. And then finally, you have full-on ad hoc sites. These can be something insofar as, like you say, planning for Bob's retirement party. If you're planning for Bob's retirement party, there's some organizations, and we'll talk about it later, where people can just come along and say, I want to create a site. And they can, it's totally up to them how they want to create it, what they want to create it for. Some organizations allow this to happen and others don't. But if they do allow it to happen, this is something where really it's user defined, and this is really on the right side of the control, the spectrum, where we're saying totally hands off. Users have total discretion about how they're going to be using groups or sites. So really, if we look at the spectrum here, public sites, intranet sites, department sites, these are scenarios where the information is outward focused. In other words, we're publishing information so that people outside of our department, we're publishing information to everybody within the organization or publicly. We are trying to communicate information that originates somewhere but is being published outwards. Whereas if we look at department collaboration and on, really these are more inward focused. So we can have more flexibility, again, because this is used for a smaller group of people and the risk of something inappropriate being released is lessened as we move down the spectrum. I'm going to X out public sites because with SharePoint Online a number of years ago, about 2 years ago, Microsoft announced that they were decommissioning the ability to have public sites using SharePoint Online. You can still do it if you host SharePoint in a hosted environment like Azure or on your own servers. But I'm going to kind of X that out just because that's not really pertinent to our current conversation. So let's talk about highly managed approaches. Highly managed approaches, like we say, are typically when we talk about outward communication. These are scenarios where, because we care about the perception of the information being communicated, typically these kind of sites are going to be highly branded. We want them to be visually appealing. We want to be able to have a sort of approval process so that the wrong information isn't published. And we want to have a way that users can find official information. Typically, this is web page content, but it can be things like links to external systems, links to maybe social media sites, that kind of thing. And there may be documents, but again, these are not documents that people are within a department are working with on a day-to-day basis. This is more official documents like the official policy, the official form, that people are trying to find the authentic official original document that they need to use. There are really two ways of doing this. Historically, we talk about publishing sites. Publishing sites have been around, like you say, honestly, since 2001 when the product was purchased, when Content Management Server came about, and then officially rolled into SharePoint 2007 and called publishing sites. This was an approach that was highly branded. You can use custom master pages with custom style sheets to create truly whichever branding you could possibly want. So these, again, when we talk about SharePoint in the past being used for public-facing websites, there were sites like that were heavily touted, like Kroger.com and Ferrari.com and Hawaiian Airlines, where users had no idea that they were working with a SharePoint site because it was so heavily branded. It really looked like any other public-facing website out there. Publishing sites come out of the box with an approval workflow, which means that if somebody wants to submit content to view, perhaps so it gets rolled up and displayed on the internet homepage, it might need to go through an approval process for us to make sure that that information is completely legitimate before it's published. Publishing sites typically are maximized for web content. What this means is you have the ability to create what are called page layouts, which means you can specify, again, from a design perspective, I want an image and it's going to be this many pixels and it goes in the top left and we're going to have a right column and the title's going to go here and the description's going to go there, and then at the bottom of the page we're going to have 3 columns. And designers really can go into extreme detail about exactly how they want pages to be laid out when a user goes in and says, I want to create a new page. Additionally, queries can be created using the content search web part and display templates. And a display template is just a custom piece of HTML and JavaScript that can be created and deployed to your site collection, which says when this content query web part says, I want to see all the latest news stories, or I want to see the latest project documents, or whatever the information is, that you're actually determining very specifically what information is being queried, how it's being displayed, how it's being sorted, how paging is happening, etc. Typically in publishing sites, oftentimes the approach in sort of traditional publishing sites is that users would never go look at list or library content. Typically, the list and library content is hidden from the user, and if you want to surface that information, it's done using the content search web part, so that, again, everything is completely branded, visually appealing, tightly controlled, because people don't necessarily know how to use lists and libraries, but they know how to navigate web pages. That's the idea. There's also the concept of image renditions that came out in later versions of SharePoint, which meant that if I uploaded a picture from my camera and it was 2,000 pixels wide, I could show it within my web page and say, this is supposed to be the 100 by 100 thumbnail. On a different page, I could say, I want to see a wide 250 by 100 pixel version of the same picture. And that way, users weren't having to download a 10 meg file to their browser, and could be displayed in different pages and in different contexts using different sizes. So again, publishing sites are used a lot of times for highly branded with workflows in place, and there are a number of models too where the publishing sites are sort of created with a hybrid, and we'll talk about that towards the end, where we can put team sites inside publishing sites. Microsoft has recently started rolling out communication sites, which are a replacement for publishing sites. Communication sites, basically the biggest thing is that they have an adaptive design. The older version of SharePoint, which is now referred to as Classic, that view of the document libraries and list, it was all created, again, back in 2007 when people didn't walk around with mobile devices connected to the internet all the time. Now, because devices are so heavily used, and not just phones, but tablets, etc., and rather than trying to retrofit the existing user interface, Microsoft just sort of started over from scratch and said, we're going to create a whole new, quote-unquote, modern approach to page design. And communication sites really take this modern page design to heart, and they create highly branded, highly visually appealing sites. We have something called a hero web part, which I'll show you in a demo, which has large, big, blocky pictures, large, stunning colors that can be used. And when you use that, it's really, again, it'll work in an adaptive design where rows of information will slide under each other as the browser gets smaller and smaller. You can create news stories, you can have a news web part to show news stories. Instead of image renditions, they actually came out with a cool concept of focal points for images as well. And that's because they realized if they're going to be automatically sizing images up and down based on different screen sizes, it'd be difficult if you are having to anticipate the sizes ahead of time, or have SharePoint decide how this images need to be cropped. So when you set a focal point, basically what you're saying is this part of the image should always show up if at all possible, no matter the screen size. So if you have a picture of people's faces, you don't want the image to be cropped so that their shirt is showing up when the image is resized, but you want to make sure that their face is always showing up. That was a concept that was first pioneered in Sway and then now is part of the modern page concept. On communication sites, you also have this concept of a calendar events. Calendars have always been problematic in publishing sites and in general in SharePoint, because SharePoint calendars do not map specifically to Outlook calendars, which means if on my company calendar, I say that there's going to be a company picnic on Wednesday, just because I put it on the company calendar doesn't mean it's actually showing up in anybody's Outlook calendar just because I put it in SharePoint. So now in communication sites, there's still not an Outlook calendar associated with the communication site, but if you show an event on the communication site, that event actually is going to have a little button that says export. So a user looking at that event can open up the event, and it'll open up an ICS file that they can import it into Outlook on their desktop or on their phone just by browsing the site, and they can, on an event-by-event basis, decide what they want to show in on their calendar. Team sites have been around forever and ever. They were around since, I think, SharePoint 2001 or 2003 on slightly different names back then. But a team site typically is meant for document collaboration, I would say. There are wiki pages in there where you can have web-based content, but really team sites in its modern version of it, I would say, really are focused on creating lists and libraries so that primarily people can work with one another. So when we talk about this inward focus versus outward focused, I'd say this is where if you create a highly managed team site, you're going to go into great detail to decide what are my content libraries, what are my columns, what are my workflows, what are my retention policies, what's my security. And when I talk about highly managed, I just mean that you as an organization, when you roll this out, are going to go into put a lot of thought and detail into how you're going to manage these sites, how you're going to manage security. It's not ad hoc at all in the sense that you're going to specify, do we need specific document libraries, do we need content types, do we need site columns, etc. When we talk about search results, if we have a highly managed solution, we can also create really amazing search experience for users. As I mentioned before, like with the content search web part, if I want to be able to display my project documents, I can display that project ID in the project manager because I know necessarily that information has been collected. The same goes for search results. If I want to provide a slider in the refinement panel for news articles, I can say, show me all the news articles between this and this date. And that's because I know that news articles necessarily have an article date that's being collected with the news article. Because I did the work up front to define the kind of information being collected, I can now have pretty exotic ways of retrieving information according to that same criteria. Another example, again, is if I have a search page where I'm searching just project documents, I can allow people to say, if I type in the word engineering, I might get 2,000 documents back, but in my refinement panel, I can say, only show me those documents. It will show me the most frequent project IDs that show up, and I can say, I only want to see the documents where the project ID is 9999. Or I just want to see all the documents where Becky Bertram is the project manager. So because, again, you've done the work to define the kind of information being collected, you can really create very specific search experiences for users, which become incredibly important as the information in your site grows. And I can't emphasize this enough because a lot of people start their SharePoint implementation when there's maybe a gig worth of data. And a gig's not a big deal, or maybe even, you know, half a gig. There may be 500 documents in the whole site collection. That's well and good, but if you manage to keep this site collection going, or your SharePoint tenant going down the road, and now you have 10 gigs of information or 100 gigs of information, it becomes far more difficult to find that information. And rather than browsing for information, search becomes paramount. So real quick, I'm just going to give a demo of creating a communication site. And in fact, I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to show a publishing site, just an example of what this might look like here. So a publishing site, so I've created this site just that's a publishing sandbox, and in here I've got my top navigation. I have different sites that are inside of that, and inside that I have a site specifically for my accounting site. If I click on that accounting site, that's another publishing site, and if I click here, I can see my accounting site, and in there maybe I've got lists and libraries, and inside that then I might have another site that's a team site instead of a publishing site. So this is actually a team site, not a publishing site, and this is set up specifically for collaboration within that accounting department. So this might be a very typical model you might see in a lot of intranet sites. I haven't built it out a whole lot, but you get the idea in terms of how a site can have a subsite. So I'm in my publishing sandbox site collection. I click on accounting, and now my URL is publishing sandbox/accounting. When I go to accounting collaboration, it now is accounting/collab. I just want to make sure you guys can all see my screen, correct, still? Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure again that you guys can see my my screen when I switch between PowerPoint and the screen, that you guys can see it.
I can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. I get nervous. I'm used to Skype, where sometimes if you switch applications, everything disappears, and I don't want to keep talking. I want to make sure you guys see the demo. Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate that. Okay, so so this is an example of sort of a publishing site model. If you go to create a collaboration site, the only place you can create it from is your SharePoint page. So to do that, you're going to click on the Create Site button, and when you go there, you have the ability to create a team site or a communication site. And I'm going to create a communication site. You can choose to create a topic, showcase, or blank. And really, topic and showcase are very different. It just means the this web part at the top of the page, it's called a hero web part, is going to be slightly different. So I'm going to say topic communication site demo. Now, if you look in here, it says site address. When I type in the name of my site, it is actually creating a site collection on the back end. Do you see this URL where it says /sites and then the name of my communication site? That's important to note, that an entire new site collection is being created, unlike the model I just showed you in a publishing site, where a sub-site is created within the current site and it's all part of the same site collection. That is very different. So I'm going to create my communication site now. It happens pretty rapidly here. Click that so it stops blinking at me. There we go, and here's my communication site. So if you look at this, this is quite a bit different than that publishing site, right? Now clearly the publishing site I hadn't branded. If I had branded it, it would have looked a lot nicer. But still, this site is really much more of what we consider more of a modern adaptive approach. So if I make my render it smaller, you see how it gets smaller, it's smaller, it resizes, it resizes, it resizes, and it's fitting those size until eventually, do you see how it went from having the multiple boxes to now being a rotator? So with this adaptive view, that hero web part is going to render different as you stretch that page. So again, the communication sites are more adaptive. We have this hero web part at the top, which again, you can, it's kind of neat. If you modify this information, you can specify what link goes in each box, what the image is. You can link to web pages, content, other kind of things, background colors, show the title and the layout or not, etc. It's a nice web part here that we can really highlight information in a visually pleasing way. Down here we've got news. This is surfacing news articles in a site. You've got events. So you can see how if you have different events here, you can click on save and close. So this is an example of events, but if I want to add a new event, I click add event, where my office, you notice that even is pulling up using Bing Maps to pull things up. So I'm going to say Savvy Technical Solutions. It's going to be here, and look at that, it even pulled up a map. Isn't that cool? I can have categories about the event. This is so even the form for creating an event is very different than what we're used to seeing in a typical SharePoint site. Oh, I have to have a name for it. Demo get. Created the event. If I go back home and I now see the event showing up, I can see it there. I can see the location, the presentation of it, and I can say add to calendar. And if I open it up, it is actually going to open up my ICS file to add it to my Outlook calendar. So again, kind of cool, but just a very different approach than publishing sites. All right, so maximizing flexibility. Let's talk about Teams and Office 365 groups. We already talked about sort of a managed approach, but when we talk, and then we talked about team sites, but finally we talk about maximizing flexibility. This is where we're talking about the other end of the spectrum, and we're really talking about ad hoc approach. In the ad hoc approach, users are allowed to create and manage site collections, sites, and security themselves. And once you have all these sort of autonomous site collections floating out there, now you really have to rely on Microsoft's artificial intelligence or machine learning to surface the information that's relevant to you. Microsoft has something called the Office Graph, which is really just a programming interface that retrieves information across Office 365 products and across Azure. So in other words, the Office Graph can say, grab information from OneDrive and SharePoint and Exchange and permissions from Azure Active Directory, and whatever information someone's retrieving, you can return that information using a call to like a web service. And that being said, it can be you can build any number of custom applications, or Delve is the Office 365 sort of implementation of this that you can see, where it's basically going to show you things like, a lot of times if you're looking like, if you want to attach a document in Outlook, it's just going to show you the most recent documents you've worked with. Or if you go to Delve, you're going to see the most recent documents. Or if you go to portal.office.com, a lot of times Office 365 assumes that, you know what, the last 5 or 10 documents you worked with are probably the documents you're going to work with. Why show you a document you created a year ago when chances are if you worked with it yesterday, you're going to want to work with it again today. So showing most recent documents and whatever product you're in, whether you're in SharePoint, whether you're editing a page or working in Exchange or navigating the Office portal or looking at profile information, a lot of times just the most recently edited documents or viewed documents are what are going to be surfaced. Microsoft also takes into account social proximity, which means that if I worked with a document with you and you edited a document and I edited a document, we're probably colleagues. So if you're, it's going to surface documents that maybe you worked on because it knows, hey, you and I are colleagues. So when it's surfacing information, it's going to take that into account. And then finally, when we talk about out-of-the-box search, again, Microsoft is currently sort of revamping the search experience as well. And at Microsoft Ignite, they in fact unveiled Bing for Business, which incorporates the Office 365 graph using search results from your Office 365 tenant right within Bing.com, which is pretty phenomenal. So again, when you just use the out-of-the-box search experience in this modern approach, it's going to use machine learning using, again, proximity, social proximity, what you've worked on recently, regardless of where it was stored within Office 365, and it's surfacing it to you. This, again, is important because when we talked about the previous information architecture model, in a highly organized hierarchical model, people a lot of times browse to information. I've had a number of clients where I tried to create really detailed search results, and they said, why are you doing this? I don't need search results. I know exactly where my documents are supposed to be saved and where to go to retrieve them. And that's nice if you're in a nicely browsable model for browsing to the information you want. But when we get to this ad hoc approach and you have all these sort of autonomous site collections floating around out there, being able to get access to the information you need becomes more and more critical in terms of managing it and getting access. So when you talk about Office 365 groups, this is a concept that Microsoft has been putting a lot of energy into. And an Office 365 group creates a whole set of information, not just a site collection, but it does typically create a site collection which is used in the context of a group. So depending on what products you have active in your tenant, an Office 365 group might have a team using the Teams chat interface. It may have a Yammer group that gets created. You could have a, within your site collection, it's going to use your OneNote notebook, your documents library. You're going to have a distribution list and a calendar tied into Exchange. You could use Planner for project management. You could do it with Staff Hub for doing shift planning. So group is really a security construct that can be tagged into any number of Office 365 applications. And one of those Office 365 applications is SharePoint. So an Office 365 group, when it's going to create it, is necessarily going to create a site collection. That site collection will not be visible from the SharePoint administration page. So you have to use other tools to be able to manage those Office 365 groups. Even though I mentioned the highly managed team site approach for these two boxes of app-specific and project sites, you can do it either way. You may say, you know what, we're going to do hands-off. We're just going to use a basic document library for each of these. We're going to use the other, planner or these other products to be able to manage information within these. So for app-specific or cross-departmental collaboration or projects, in this case, you may still want to go with a highly managed team site approach, or you may choose to go with this Office 365 group approach. It's really up to you. I want to point out the communication sites, like I showed you before, even though they tend to follow the highly managed approach that we tend to associate with publishing sites, because the replacement of publishing sites, it's important to note that they are actually autonomous site collections. And when you create a new communication site, it is not a hierarchical model like the traditional site collection model with subsites. And that is extremely important to note, especially when it comes to information architecture. So if I want to create a group-enabled SharePoint site collection, what I'm essentially going to do is, if you go to, for instance, the people page, if I go to my tenant and I click on people, you'll notice here on the left side, you can see all the groups that have already been created within my tenant. I actually can go ahead and just say create group. I'm going to give it a group name. And notice, just like with a communication site, it's going to have a group name. It's going to have actually a group email address, because it's essentially creating a distribution list on the back end. I have privacy settings, whether this is public or private. And when I create it, it actually is going to create that site collection on the back end that is bound to that. After I've created it, I could go ahead and add members to the group, but I'm going to say not now. And now it is actually generating that group. If I click on the Files tab, it is actually taking me to my document library within that site collection. But in fact, I'm going to click on Browse that library in this interface, and what it's doing is it's opening up a new window, and it's actually taking me to that site collection. So if we look at that URL, once again, we're going to see that it automatically created a site collection with the URL of /sites/demo group. So the group that was just created now actually has its own site collection. You can see here I've got conversations, documents, notebook, pages, etc. I think this is happening because the site is not finished getting provisioned. I think that's why the error is happening. It's still provisioning it on the back end. It tries to get you there as quick as possible, not to slow you down. All right, so when we talk about managing chaos, the last thing I want to talk about is putting controls in place to manage this sort of ability for anybody, if they want, to just go and create a group, especially when you don't necessarily have a lot of visibility into what's being created, or deciding who gets to do this or not. So I want to talk a little bit about ways to manage it so you just don't have completely unbridled growth within your tenant. What I'm not going to talk about right now are scripting approaches or third-party products. You can do a whole lot with PowerShell nowadays. There's specifically, I will mention the Patterns and Practices group has created a whole lot of open source scripts. And using the Office graph, it's possible to access information about Office 365 groups. So if you're using a scripted approach or third-party tools, it is possible to really get visibility into these groups, manage a whole lot of things regarding these groups programmatically. But right now I'm just going to talk about your out-of-the-box approaches, just in the user interface, just to get you going. So you really have three things you can do. Number one, you can shut off the ability for people to create a new site, a new communication site or a new team site that creates a new site collection and a new Office 365 group just out of the box. You can just say, I'm going to turn off the ability for them to do that. It's possible also to see the Office 365 groups that have been created, and if you don't like the fact that it was created, you can talk to the owner and you have the ability to just go in and completely delete that group. And finally, you can think about managing the creation process itself. So the first thing is if you go to the SharePoint administration page, the SharePoint Admin Center, and you go to the settings page, you actually can see that there's a button that says hide the create site command. This means if you're on that SharePoint page where I created the communication sites from, if you change this radio button in the settings page, nobody's going to see that create button. People will not be able to just create a site, new site collection willy-nilly by creating that button. Now that being said, if you do that, typically if you say create new site, it's typically, in the past, it would create a new site inside the, you would specify which site collection was created inside. I think that's now changed when you create a new site. Even if it's team site, it creates a new site collection. If you go to the Office 365 Admin Center, you're actually going to get a new option in the left nav, or I guess not a new option, it's been around for a while, but for managing groups. And you're going to see all those groups listed out. And you'll notice that these groups actually include like Exchange security groups as well as Office 365 groups. And when you look at a specific group, you actually have the ability to click the delete group button. So you can go in and delete a group after it's been created. Managing group site collection structure. It is not possible by default to have something like a site template, so that every time a new Office 365 group is created and it produces a new site collection, that it's going to create a pre-rendered site collection with specific content types and site columns and retention policies and all this kind of stuff in there. So what you can do is just say, you know what, we have a sort of business approach that every time that new group is created, we're going to manually go in there and start applying all the things we would for our intranet site. So we can say, you know what, each time a new project site is created, I'm going to go in and I'm going to assign the content types, the site columns, retention policies, templates, and everything on a site collection by site collection basis. And this may be not a bad approach. If you're like, you know what, we only create new 10 groups a year, maybe that's one a month. If that, you can say, you know what, I can do that level of work for a manual process because it doesn't happen that often. You also can use scripts, like I mentioned, using PowerShell. There are a number of scripts where you can go in and maybe after the fact, instead of manually configuring it, perhaps after a group is created, you create a script that goes in and applies everything, so sort of programmatically, but it's going to happen again sort of after the fact. It is possible to use that content type hub to your advantage. So every SharePoint tenant has something called a content type hub where you can define all the content types and site collections that should be used across the site collections. What you do is you choose to publish a content type, which means all the other site collections can now use those content types. So for instance, if you do have that content type called project document, if you publish it using the content type hub, then it means all your other site collections, including your Office 365 group site collections, now have access to these content types. So that's sort of out-of-the-box functionality that you can use to your advantage. If you're within an existing site collection and you create a new subsite, about maybe, I don't remember when they changed this, but up to maybe a year ago, if you created a subsite within your site collection, it went ahead and created an Office 365 group just for that subsite. But a lot of times that really became annoying and problematic because we sort of depend on the fact that site collections are supposed to inherit security models for subsites, like we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So they've changed it now that anytime you create a new subsite inside an existing site collection, you're going to see here in parentheses where it specifically states that you are creating a team site that is not bound to an Office 365 group. The one thing that's missing here is the fact that there are cases where people say, you know what, I've already built my site collection. We've been using SharePoint Online for a number of years. I've already got a subsite called accounting. I don't want to create a new accounting site collection tied to an accounting group. I have an existing site. It's an existing team site. I like it very much, but I would like an Office 365 group to be created that uses this existing site. That functionality does not exist yet, but it's coming down the road. And that way you can have sort of this highly managed approach of creating subsites with content types, document policies, etc. But you can still have the additional benefits that come with a group in terms of having distribution lists, Outlook calendars, everything else I mentioned. So it's not there yet, but hopefully we'll get there soon. This was just released last week at Microsoft Ignite, and this is a hybrid approach for communication sites. And this is basically the concept that you can create a hub site, which is sort of a top-level umbrella site, and then you can associate different communication sites with it. One of the problems through the years with the sub-site model is the fact that a lot of times people would create, even what I've talked about, this concept of sort of departments, having a site and a sub-site organized according to department. But what happens when you have a reorganization and suddenly facilities management now sits underneath finance instead of sits underneath the office sub-site? There may be different times where you would have to use third-party tools to actually move those site objects around your site collection. Well, if those site collections are now considered, each of those sub-sites are no longer sub-sites, but a whole autonomous site collection, now when you have this hub sort of serves as an umbrella, and you can just have multiple hubs, and then you can associate and reassociate your site collections with the various hubs. So the hope was that by every site being its own site collection or an autonomous unit, you can sort of reshuffle them without too much work. And those hub sites will be able to actually roll up content from its child sites. And a hub site can be associated with either a team site or a communication site, which means if you create a news article in a communication site, that news article can be surfaced in the parent hub site. When you're creating a new group, it's possible within that settings page to specify that new groups get created under the /teams URL instead of /sites. This is a good way of being able to denote when you see that URL, if you're running scripts or showing any kind of reports and you see that word teams in there, that might be a good way of understanding that this was not something that was created in the SharePoint Admin Center. This was actually something that was rendered or was created as an Office 365 dynamically created group, that this site collection is a group site collection. So you can specify that new groups are created under this different URL, which can be good in just giving a visual indication of whether a site collection was intentionally created sort of in that managed approach, or if it's the more flexible approach of an Office 365 group. All right, so let's show that real quick. So if I'm looking at my SharePoint settings page, if I scroll down, this is where you can see I can specify hide the create site button, in which case that other section just sort of collapses. Or if I say we can create the site, I can specify whether they can create, whether you saw the options before were just a team site or communication site. I could say that, you know what, you can create a classic site, or I could say you can only create a team site or communication site. Or I can go in and I can say I want to create a classic site, and I can actually specify where that site is going to be created inside which site collection if I'm talking about a classic site itself. If this approach is taken, then when someone creates a new site using that create button, they're creating actually a subsite inside an existing site collection, which is different than the default, which is that they're creating a communication site or a team site as a completely new site collection. Right here, you can see the drop-down menu that you can say, are we creating the new group, and it's under the sites or that teams or a namespace there. When you go to the Office Admin Center, you can see here that we have on the left side a groups label here, and under the groups you can see all those groups that are being surfaced. And that demo group that I just created, if I open it up, I can actually go in and I can delete the group, and it says, are you sure? And when I go ahead and delete the group, that site collection will go away. But as it says, it might take a little bit of time. So we're getting to the end here. I just wanted to give some ideas about sort of how you want to organize information in your site using these different kind of sites. If you're using sort of the traditional model, you might say that for your basic intranet sites, so you're going to use publishing sites, again, which are highly stylized, highly branded, showing information like news stories or official documentation, until you get down to your sort of collaboration sites that might be inside of your site collection. And that's where you're doing more document management and collaboration at the department level. And you might use a team site for that. And that being said, if you have either these, the other boxes I showed on the chart before, whether it's perhaps a cross departmental group like compliance, or a project site, which are time constraint projects, or maybe just completely ad hoc, these groups are going to also use a team site, but instead of being part of that site collection hierarchy, they live all as their autonomous site collections and part of Office 365 groups. This is how a lot of times I build intranet sites for my clients currently. As a caveat, hubs have not been released yet. It actually was just announced last week. I have not seen hubs in person other than in demos, so this is all conjecture right now. But I would talk about this hub blended model as a way where you can basically say I've got a communication site, and then I'm going to associate it with a hub. So I've got a hub called HR, and inside maybe I have a team site called Benefits, which has a lot of document sites. It was created with a team site. And then I've got my wellness communication site, which is more like news stories about, you know, how you can stay fit and come join us at the health fair. And so you might have, or in legal, you know, if you have, again, newsy sort of site talking about what's happening in the legal world versus a team of people using a team site where you actually have this group-enabled team where people are working together and have a site, a team site. And both of these can be associated with that hub site. But that being said, you may still have these autonomous groups that sit out and are not associated with the hub, but they really are, again, their own site collections, just like in the last slide. This is how I imagine it, but again, have not done this yet, so we'll see how time will tell how these play out when they're released. The last thing I want to point out is we have this new concept of classic versus modern views. If you have created a publishing site, by default, your web page content is going to use the classic view, but all of your library pages are going to use the modern view. This is an important thing that you want to think about when you're rolling out your implementation, because it's very discombobulating and confusing users if all of a sudden they were looking at a highly branded web page and then they click on the link to a library and then the user interface completely shifts to use that modern approach. You kind of have two choices. Either you completely turn off that modern approach for your site collection or your tenant, and you say, I just want to use the classic approach, in which case we're not using modern pages at all. Or you start to replace. It is possible to create a modern page inside a traditional classic team site and then set that as a home page. And if you do that, basically you're saying, I'm going to get rid of all the wiki pages in my classic team site, and I'm going to create modern pages in my site pages libraries. And that way the user interface, you're still using the site collection sub-site model, but in terms of the user interface, you are using a modern page with a modern library interface. I just would suggest please don't try and mix the two because, again, it can be really confusing to users. All right, well, that was a pretty long presentation here. I see that 8 of you are still hanging in there. That's great. I know I've gone about an hour and a half, so a lot of information here. But if you want to follow up here, I just would say that I created about a year ago a pretty in-depth presentation about content types, lists, and libraries that you can view on the Opsgility channel on YouTube, and it's still pretty relevant in terms of templates and content types and the retention policies. And of course, if you want to get a lot more information, you can view my Introduction to SharePoint Online course, which is geared really towards end users and getting to know all the interfaces of SharePoint, all its functionality. Or if you take the SharePoint Online administration course, this is talking about more like setting up permissions, creating site collections, understanding about storage limits, and things like that. And that is it. Are there any questions?
Well, I'm not seeing any questions appearing in the question module.
Okay. With that, then, I think we're it. I think that's it for today.
All right, well, Becky, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Everyone, thank you for participating, and have a great day.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.